What if the American dream isn't a house, a career, or fluent English? What if it's just one hand holding yours? I came to America chasing a dream I couldn't even name and nearly gave up because my words felt broken. But then a quiet veteran taught me something no textbook could, that the language of love doesn't need perfection. This is our story, and it might just change how you see your own. The noise in my head. Imagine landing in a country where the air itself sounds different. Not just the accent, the texture of the noise. Car horns have a different rhythm. Strangers' laughter carries a frequency your brain hasn't learned to decode. That was me, stepping off the plane at LAX with 2 suitcases and a head full of textbook English that suddenly felt like a dead language. I'd spent years studying. I knew the difference between present perfect and past perfect. I could conjugate verbs in my sleep. But standing in line at immigration, the officer asked me, "How long you planning to stay?" And my mind went blank. Not because I didn't understand the words, but because my brain was too busy screaming. This is it. You've failed before you've even begun. Here's what they don't tell you about learning English or any language for real life. Your brain doesn't freeze because you're stupid. It freezes because it's trying to protect you. Neuroscientists call it the affective filter. When you're anxious, your amygdala, that little almond-shaped alarm system in your head, hijacks your prefrontal cortex, the part that actually remembers vocabulary and grammar. In other words, your brain literally shuts down your language skills to save you from what it thinks is a tiger. Except the tiger is just a guy asking how long you're staying. So there I was, inside that sterile airport hallway, sweating through my sweater, and I managed to stutter. "I stay maybe 1 year?" The officer raised an eyebrow, stamped my passport, and waved me through. I walked past him feeling like I'd just survived a car crash. That first month was a blur of survival. I'd go to the grocery store and spend 10 minutes rehearsing, "Excuse me, where can I find the milk?" in my head. Then I'd get to the aisle, see 10 different kinds of milk. Whole, skim, almond, oat, and panic because my script didn't cover that. I'd grab the first one I saw and leave, feeling defeated by dairy. My apartment was a cramped studio in a neighborhood where the walls were thin enough to hear my neighbor practicing scales on a trumpet at 6 a.m. I'd lie in bed, listening to that trumpet, and think, what am I doing here? I left everything, my family, my friends, my language, to live in a place where I can't even ask for the right milk. The loneliness was a physical thing. It sat on my chest. I'd call my mom back home and speak in our native language, and for those 30 minutes, I'd feel normal again. But the moment I hung up, the silence would rush back in, louder than the trumpet. Here's what I didn't know then. The silence was actually preparing me for something. When you strip away the comfort of fluent conversation, you start paying attention to other things. The way someone's shoulders relax when they're about to smile. The hesitation in a voice that means they're choosing their words carefully too. I didn't know I was about to meet someone who would teach me that English isn't about getting the words right. It's about being brave enough to say them wrong. But before that could happen, I had to hit rock bottom in a language I barely understood. And rock bottom, for me, came on a Tuesday night during a rainstorm that made the city feel like it was drowning. I'd been in the US for 3 months. My savings were shrinking. I'd sent out dozens of job applications. But every interview was a torture session of misunderstood questions and answers that came out in the wrong tense. One interviewer looked at my resume, then at me, and said, "Your English is interesting." He meant it as a compliment, I think. But I heard, "You don't belong here." That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment, back against the door, listening to the rain pound the roof. I pulled out my phone to text a friend back home, but my fingers hovered over the keyboard. What would I say? That I'd made a mistake? that the American dream everyone talks about felt like a joke? I opened a language app instead, the kind with the little green owl. I stared at a lesson on present continuous, and something in me just snapped. Not dramatically, quietly. I closed the app. I turned off my phone. And I let the rain be the only sound for a long time. That was the moment I stopped trying to learn English the way I thought I was supposed to. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to trade flashcards for something far more effective. A story. A story that would begin, as all good stories do, with a stranger. The silent veteran. Let me describe the first time I saw him. Because memory does this strange thing where it paints some details in neon and leaves others in fog. It was a Thursday late afternoon at a laundromat on the corner of a street I couldn't pronounce without pausing halfway through. He was sitting on a plastic chair, back straight like someone had glued a ruler to his spine, watching a dryer tumble his clothes in slow circles. His hands rested on his knees. He wasn't scrolling a phone. He wasn't reading. He was just there. I'd seen plenty of Americans by then. Loud ones on the bus, fast-talking cashiers, joggers who said, "Have a good one," without breaking stride. But this man was different. He had the kind of stillness that made noise around him seem rude. When I walked in with my basket of damp laundry, I caught his eyes for a second, gray, like the sky before snow, and then he looked away as if giving me permission to exist in his space. I didn't know he was a veteran. I didn't know his name. I didn't know that the quietness I was noticing was partly the residue of 2 deployments and the particular way the military teaches a person to sit. In silence, because sometimes silence is the only thing that makes sense. All I knew was that he made me feel less like a foreigner. Because here was an American who also seemed to be searching for the right words. We didn't talk that day. Or the next week. But the laundromat became a strange habit. I'd show up with my 1 load of clothes, and he'd be there with his 2 army green duffel bags. We'd occupy opposite corners, listening to the machines hum, and occasionally our eyes would meet in the reflection of the glass dryer doors. It was a weird kind of companionship, the kind where neither person feels obligated to fill the air with noise. Then one afternoon, a miracle happened. Well, not a miracle. A small disaster that turned into a doorway. I was trying to figure out which dryer had my sheets, and I mixed up the numbers. I opened a machine that wasn't mine, and a pair of boxer shorts fell out onto the floor. I froze, face burning, because in my culture, touching a stranger's undergarments is a social catastrophe. I bent down to pick them up, apologizing in a jumble of English and my native language, and suddenly a voice said, "It's okay. Those are mine." It was him. He was standing right there, and he was smiling. Not a big smile, just a small curve at the corner of his mouth, like he'd forgotten how and was trying to remember. He picked up the boxers, tossed them back in, and then he said the longest sentence I'd ever heard him speak. "You're new here, aren't you?" 3 months in the country, and that was the first time someone had asked me that without making it sound like an accusation. So I told him the truth. I said, yes, very new, and very bad at laundry. He laughed. It was a rusty sound, like a door hinge that hadn't been used in years. Then he pointed to the machine I'd meant to open and said, "Number 4. I always pick number 4. Lucky." That word, lucky, stuck with me. Because in that moment, standing between rows of humming dryers, I felt something I hadn't felt since arriving. I felt seen. Not as a language learner, not as an immigrant, not as someone who couldn't conjugate verbs fast enough. Just as a person who had accidentally grabbed a stranger's underwear and was trying to survive. We sat down on the plastic chairs after that. He told me his name was Tom. He told me he'd been in the army for 12 years, and now he was figuring things out. He didn't say what things, and I didn't ask. Instead, I told him about my country, my family, my textbook English that never prepared me for real life. He listened like each word was a gift. When I struggled to find a word, he waited. He didn't finish my sentences. He just waited. There's a neuroscience thing here, and I promise I'm not trying to turn this into a lecture. But when you're learning a language, your brain is constantly scanning for threat. It's why a raised eyebrow can make you forget everything. What Tom did, without knowing it, was lower my affective filter. He created a space where mistakes weren't dangerous. They were just part of talking. We exchanged numbers before we left. He wrote his on a torn piece of cardboard from a detergent box. I saved it under the name Tom Laundry because I was too shy to ask his last name. That night, I went home and opened my language app again. I didn't study. I stared at the screen and thought about how I'd just had a real conversation, with mistakes, with pauses, with a moment involving someone's boxer shorts, and I hadn't died. In fact, I'd felt more alive than I had in months. Here's what I didn't know then. That laundromat conversation was the first thread in a story that would redefine everything I thought I knew about language, about America, and about the dream I'd been chasing. But threads are fragile. And before we could weave something meaningful, life would throw us both into a storm that would test whether we could still hold on. Rain on a stranger's roof. There's a particular kind of rain that falls in Southern California that most movies don't show you. It doesn't come down gently, like a curtain. It waits for months, pretending it doesn't exist. And then one night it decides to remember itself and hurls everything it's been holding back onto the pavement in a single, violent hour. That Tuesday night was that rain. And I was sitting on the floor of my studio apartment, back against the door, letting the sound of it drown out the sound of my own thoughts. 3 months in America. 3 months of your English is interesting and job applications that disappeared into the void. 3 months of rehearsing conversations in my head that never went the way I'd planned. My savings account was a number I'd stopped checking because checking it felt like watching a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. I'd come here with a suitcase full of dreams and a head full of vocabulary lists. And neither of them seemed to matter in a country where people talked faster than my brain could translate. You want to know what loneliness feels like when you're learning a new language? It feels like being a child again, but without the innocence. It feels like having opinions and humor and a personality locked inside you, and no key to let any of it out. I was funny in my native language. I was sharp. I could make people laugh at dinner parties. But in English, I was a simplified version of myself, a cartoon drawn with 3 crayons instead of the whole box. That night, after yet another interview that went nowhere, I sat in the dark and let the rain do the crying I couldn't seem to do. My phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. I ignored it. Then it buzzed a 3rd time, and the persistence annoyed me enough to look. It was Tom, the man from the laundromat, the one with the gray eyes and the quiet way of sitting. His text read, "You okay? Rain like this makes people disappear into their heads. Don't disappear." I stared at those words for a long time. 7 words. That was all he'd typed. But somehow, 7 words from a near stranger felt heavier than the silence that had been pressing on my chest for weeks. I typed back, "I'm okay. Just tired." A lie wrapped in a truth. He replied, "Tired, I understand. Want company? No talking if you don't want. Just so you're not alone." No talking. He offered to sit in silence with me in the middle of a rainstorm, because he understood that sometimes the hardest thing isn't being alone. It's being alone with a language that won't let you explain why you're hurting. I said yes. He showed up 20 minutes later in a faded army jacket, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. He didn't say anything when I opened the door. He just stepped in, looked around my cramped studio with its single bed and stack of textbooks, and sat down on the floor where I'd been sitting. I sat down next to him. For a long time, we just listened to the rain pound the roof above us. Then he said something that changed something in me. He said, "You know what I did my first year back? After the army?" I shook my head. He pointed to the window, at the rain streaking down the glass. I sat in my apartment and stared at walls. For weeks. Didn't talk to anyone.
Didn't want to.
Because I didn't have the words for what I was feeling.
Still don't, half the time.
Here was an American born here, raised here, telling me he also struggled to find words. Not because of grammar or vocabulary, but because some feelings don't come with subtitles. And in that moment, something clicked. I'd been treating English like a test. I was failing. But Tom was showing me that language isn't a test. It's a bridge. And bridges are built slowly, plank by plank, often in the rain. We didn't talk much after that. He stayed for an hour, maybe two. At some point, I fell asleep on the floor, and when I woke up, he was gone. There was a blanket over me that I didn't remember putting there. And a text on my phone. "You didn't disappear." That's something. Here's what science says about moments like that. Your brain has a system called the default mode network. It's the part that activates when you're not doing anything specific. Just sitting and existing. For people who are lonely or struggling, that network can become a loop of negative thoughts, replaying failures and fears over and over. But when you're with someone who doesn't demand anything from you, no performance, no perfect sentences, no explanations, that loop quiets down. Your brain stops scanning for threats and starts to rest. Tom didn't know he was offering me neurological relief. He just knew I needed someone to sit in the rain with. The next morning, the storm had passed. I opened my windows and let the wet air fill my apartment. I looked at my textbooks stacked in the corner, and for the first time, I didn't feel angry at them. They weren't the enemy. They were just tools, dumb, neutral tools. The enemy had been my belief that I had to be perfect before I deserved to be seen. I texted Tom that afternoon. Not to thank him. Thank you felt too small. I texted him a question instead. "Do you want to get coffee sometime? The kind where we actually talk." He replied with 3 words. "I'd like that." 3 words. But they were enough to make me believe that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't made a mistake coming here. Maybe the dream I'd been chasing, the job, the money, the fluency, wasn't the dream at all. Maybe the dream was simpler. Maybe the dream was a hand reaching for yours in the dark. I didn't know it then, but that coffee would be the beginning of something I'd never planned for. Something that would test my English, my heart, and every assumption I'd ever made about what it means to belong somewhere. A cup of coffee, shared. Let me tell you about the coffee shop where everything began to shift. It wasn't one of those trendy places with exposed brick and baristas who look like they've just finished a poetry reading. It was a corner diner with cracked vinyl booths and a menu where the coffee was simply listed as coffee. No adjectives, no origins, no promises. Tom chose it because it was close to his apartment, but I suspect he also chose it because the fluorescent lighting was too harsh for anyone to pretend to be someone they weren't. I arrived 10 minutes early, which meant I spent 10 minutes rehearsing. Not vocabulary. Not grammar. I rehearsed how to be myself in a language that still felt like a borrowed coat, functional, but not quite mine. What if I couldn't find the words? What if the conversation stalled, and we sat in that fluorescent silence, and he realized I was as empty as my bank account? He walked in exactly on time, which I later learned was a military habit. He ordered 2 coffees before I could even stand up, black for him, cream and sugar for me. He remembered how I'd taken it at the laundromat when I'd said, "Coffee, please," with the white because I'd forgotten the word for cream. That small detail that he noticed disarmed something in me. We sat across from each other in a booth by the window. The rain from the night before had left puddles on the street that reflected the gray sky. And then we talked. Not about anything important at first. He asked where I'd grown up. I described my hometown in sentences that felt like they were built with blocks a toddler would use, simple, clunky, but mine. He listened the same way he had in the laundromat, like each word was being placed carefully into a collection he didn't want to lose. Then he told me about the army. Not the dramatic parts. He skipped over those with the ease of someone who'd practiced leaving them out. He told me about the silence after, about coming home to a country that thanked him for his service and then didn't know what to do with him. About the nights he'd sit in his car in the driveway because walking inside meant pretending he was fine. Here's what I learned that afternoon. Tom didn't speak much. But when he did, his words were like a clean window. You could see right through to what he meant. There was no decoration, no flourish, just truth. And in my struggle to speak English perfectly, I'd been doing the opposite. I'd been hiding behind vocabulary I didn't really own, using words that sounded impressive but felt hollow. I told him that. I said, I feel like I'm pretending. Every time I open my mouth, I'm trying to sound like someone else. Someone who belongs here. He stirred his coffee for a long moment, watching the cream swirl into the black. Then he said, when I got back, I couldn't talk to anyone. Not my mom, not my friends. They wanted the old me back. But I didn't know how to be that person anymore. So, I just stopped talking. He looked up at me. Then I met you. And you couldn't speak English well, so you didn't expect me to speak well either. We were both bad at it. That's what made it safe. That's when I understood something I hadn't read in any textbook. Language isn't a skill you master alone. It's a space you co-create with another person. When both people are willing to be imperfect, that space becomes wide enough for something real to grow. There's a concept in linguistics called communicative competence. It's the idea that being fluent doesn't mean knowing every word. It means being able to navigate meaning with another person, using whatever tools you have. A gesture, a wrong word that still conveys the right feeling, a pause that says, I'm trying. Tom and I were building communicative competence together, without either of us knowing the term for it. We stayed at that diner for 3 hours. The waitress refilled our cups twice. By the time we left, the puddles on the street had dried, and the gray sky had cracked open to let a little sun through. Tom walked me to my bus stop. We stood there for a minute, not saying anything, and then he said, I'd like to do this again. If you want. I said yes. Of course I said yes. On the bus ride home, I pulled out my phone and deleted the language app with a green owl. Not because I was giving up on English, but because I realized that the best classroom I'd found wasn't an app or a textbook. It was a cracked vinyl booth in a diner with a man who didn't care if I forgot the word for cream. That week, something shifted in me. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head before I had them. I stopped apologizing for my accent. When I went to the grocery store, I let myself take the time I needed. I asked the cashier how her day was going, and when she answered too fast, I just said, I'm still learning English. Can you say that again? And she did. And she smiled. It sounds small, but for someone who'd been shrinking herself for months, it felt like taking up space again. Like I was allowed to exist in this country even if my sentences weren't perfect. Even if I paused in the middle of a story to search for a word. Even if sometimes the word I found was the wrong one. Tom and I met again that weekend. Then the weekend after that. We'd walk through his neighborhood, and he'd point to things, a tree, a mailbox, a house with peeling paint, and tell me their names. Not like a teacher. Like someone showing a friend the landmarks of his inner geography. I started keeping a notebook of the words I learned from him. Not academic words. Ordinary words. Sidewalk.
Porch.
Screen door. Wisteria. the purple flower that climbed over a fence on our walking route. He'd say a word, and I'd write it down, and then I'd use it in a sentence, and he'd nod or gently correct me, and we'd keep walking. This was the English I'd been missing. Not the English of textbooks and job interviews. The English of wisteria and screen doors. The English of a man who'd learned to speak again because someone let him take his time. I didn't know I was falling in love. Not yet. I thought I was just learning a language. But somewhere between the coffee and the walks, between the imperfect sentences and the silences that felt like home, the lines began to blur. A walk through his past. There's a rhythm that develops when you walk the same streets with the same person week after week. You stop noticing the landmarks and start noticing the gaps between them, the silence that settles in when you've said everything you meant to say and haven't yet found what comes next. Tom and I had fallen into that rhythm by the time summer arrived. We'd meet on Saturday mornings. He'd make us coffee in his kitchen. And we'd walk through his neighborhood like two people who'd been doing this for years instead of months. His neighborhood was not the America I'd seen in movies. There were no manicured lawns or white picket fences. The houses were small and close together, some with paint that had given up years ago, others with gardens that spilled onto the sidewalk like they were trying to escape. Tom knew every house, not the people inside. He wasn't the type to knock on doors and introduce himself, but the houses themselves. He knew which one had a magnolia tree that bloomed too early and lost its flowers to the first spring wind. He knew where a family of foxes had made a den under a porch. He knew the corner where a kid had hit a baseball through a window the summer before, and the whole block had come out to help clean up the glass. This was his America, not the one on postcards. The one that existed in the small, unglamorous spaces between people who didn't have much, but had learned to share what they had. I learned more about Tom during those walks than I had in all our diner conversations combined, because walking loosened something in him. When we sat across a table, he'd answer my questions with a few words and then fall quiet. But walking side by side, looking forward instead of at each other, he'd let sentences stretch longer. He told me about growing up in a town that didn't exist anymore, not literally, but the way all hometowns stop existing when you leave them long enough. He told me about his father, who'd worked at a factory that closed when Tom was 16, and who'd spent the rest of his life being angry at a world that had moved on without asking his permission. I joined the army because I didn't know what else to do, he said one Saturday, as we passed a fire hydrant that had been painted to look like a Dalmatian. My dad said it would make a man out of me. I think he just wanted me out of the house. He said this without bitterness. Just fact. I was learning that Tom delivered hard truths the way other people delivered weather reports. Not asking for sympathy, just naming what was there. In return, I told him things I hadn't told anyone in America, about leaving a job I loved because the economy in my country had collapsed, about the night before my flight, when I'd sat in my childhood bedroom and tried to memorize the sound of my mother's laughter because I didn't know when I'd hear it again, about the shame of arriving here with a degree that no one recognized and a language that turned to sand in my mouth. Here's what I noticed. When I told these stories, I didn't struggle for words the way I did in job interviews. The words came slowly, sometimes with pauses, sometimes with me circling a concept until I found the right shape for it. But Tom never rushed me. He'd kick a pebble down the sidewalk or stop to look at a bird on a telephone wire, and he'd wait until I was ready to continue. His patience was a gift I didn't know how to thank him for. One afternoon, we stopped in front of a house with a porch swing that looked like it hadn't been used in a decade. The wood was gray with weather, and one of the chains had rusted through, so the swing hung at a crooked angle. Tom looked at it for a long time. My grandmother had one like that, he said. She'd sit out there every evening with a glass of sweet tea and watch the street. She'd wave at everyone who walked by. She knew everyone's name. He paused. Then, quieter. She was the first person I called when I got back. Before my mom. Before anyone. I called her and I said, "Grandma, I'm home." And she said, "I know, honey. I've been waiting." His voice cracked on the word waiting. He turned away, pretending to examine a crack in the sidewalk, and I pretended not to notice him wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. We stood there for a moment, two people pretending not to see each other's grief, and then I did something that surprised both of us. I reached out and took his hand. His hand was rough, calloused in places where his fingers met his palm. For a second, he went completely still. Then his fingers closed around mine. Not tight, just present. We stood like that for maybe a minute, not moving, not speaking. A car drove by. A dog barked somewhere down the street. And I felt, for the first time since I'd arrived in this country, that I was standing on solid ground. We let go when it felt natural to let go. Neither of us mentioned it, but something had shifted. The walks after that were different. Not in obvious ways. We still talked about the same things, walked the same streets. But there was a new texture to our silence. A warmth that hadn't been there before. I started to notice things about him I hadn't let myself notice before. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, a rare event, but glorious when it happened. The way he'd adjust his pace to match mine without seeming to think about it. The way he'd remember small details I'd mentioned weeks earlier, like my favorite flower or the name of the street where I'd first gotten lost. I told myself it was friendship. I told myself I was grateful for his patience, his kindness, his willingness to sit with me while I fumbled through sentences like a child learning to tie shoes. I told myself all the sensible things a person tells themselves when they're falling in love and don't want to admit it. But there's a particular danger in learning a language with someone. You start to associate the act of speaking with the act of being heard. And when you've spent months feeling invisible, being heard by one person can feel like being saved. One evening, after a walk that took us farther than usual, we ended up at a small park near the edge of his neighborhood. There was a bench under a tree, and we sat there as the light turned from gold to amber to the soft blue of early evening. He asked me what I missed most about home. I said, "The sound of my mother's voice." Not what she says, just the sound. I didn't know I'd forget it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandmother used to sing old songs. Nothing fancy. Just while she was cooking or folding laundry. I used to think it was annoying." He laughed a little, a dry sound. Now, I'd give anything to hear it again. We sat there until the streetlights came on, casting pools of orange light on the sidewalk. Neither of us wanted to leave. Neither of us knew how to say what we were feeling in a way that wouldn't sound like too much or too little. So we just sat, letting the evening do the talking. When I finally stood to go, he walked me to the bus stop. We stood under the light, waiting for the bus that would take me back to my studio apartment, and he said something I've never forgotten. He said, "You know how to say 'I'm scared' in your language?" I told him, 2 syllables. He repeated them, his American accent making the sounds come out wrong, and we both laughed. Then he said, "I'm scared too, just so you know." The bus came. I got on. I watched him walk away with his hands in his pockets, and I thought about all the words I knew in English, and all the words I didn't. The words for love. The words for what was growing between us. The words that would either build something or break something. I didn't have them yet. But I was starting to believe that maybe, with him, I could learn. When differences collide. Falling in love is easy when you're both speaking the same language. But when you're not, when every sentence requires effort and every emotion requires translation, love becomes something else entirely. It becomes a negotiation, A puzzle. A thing you build with your hands because you don't yet have the words to build it with your voice. Tom and I had been seeing each other for 4 months when the first real crack appeared. It was a Saturday, the kind of day that started with sunlight slanting through his kitchen window and ended with both of us sitting in silence, wondering if we'd made a terrible mistake. The morning had been fine. We'd walked to a farmer's market a few blocks from his house, and I'd practiced my English by asking vendors about their produce. Tom stood beside me, not correcting me, just present. I bought a basket of strawberries and felt proud of myself for negotiating the transaction without freezing. Then we went back to his place to make lunch. I was chopping vegetables while he heated oil in a pan, and I made a joke. It was a simple joke, something I'd have said without thinking in my native language. But when I translated it into English, it came out wrong. The tone was off. The timing was off. Tom looked at me with a confused expression, and then he laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that comes from not knowing what else to do. I felt the heat rise to my face. It was a joke, I said, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. I was making a joke. I know, he said. I just didn't understand it. Those 6 words landed in my chest like stones. I knew he didn't mean them as criticism. He was stating a fact. But in that moment, the fact felt like a verdict. You don't belong here. Your humor doesn't translate. The person you are in your head cannot become the person you are in this language. I put down the knife. I need to go, I said. And I walked out. He called after me, but I didn't stop. I walked the 15 blocks back to my apartment with my jaw clenched and my eyes burning. Not because I was angry at him, but because I was angry at myself. Why couldn't I just speak? Why did every sentence feel like carrying a box up a flight of stairs? Why was I so exhausting to be around? Here's what I didn't understand then, and what I'm telling you now because maybe you felt it too. When you're learning a new language, you lose more than words. You lose your sense of yourself. You lose the version of you that was quick and clever and knew exactly what to say in every situation. And the grief of that loss doesn't go away just because someone is patient with you. Sometimes their patience makes it worse because you feel like you're failing them. I spent the rest of that day in my apartment, not answering Tom's texts. He sent 3. The first, I'm sorry if I hurt you. The second, I didn't mean anything by it. The third, can we talk? I stared at that third message for an hour before typing back, I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at English. He replied immediately, then let's be angry at English together. That made me laugh despite myself. And in that laugh, something softened. I agreed to meet him the next day. But when we sat down at the diner where we'd had our first real conversation, something was different. The ease we'd built over months of walking and talking had fractured. We were both trying too hard. He was choosing his words carefully, which made him sound like a stranger. I was measuring every sentence before I spoke, which made me sound like a robot. We ordered coffee. We stared at the sugar packets. The silence stretched until it was unbearable. Then Tom said something that broke the tension in a way neither of us expected. He said, in the army, we had this thing called the fog of war. It's when everything is happening at once. Noise, chaos, people yelling, and you can't tell what's real and what isn't. You just have to act, even if you're not sure, even if you might be wrong. He looked at me. This feels like that sometimes. Like I can't tell if I'm saying the right thing or the wrong thing. But I know I don't want to stop trying. I wanted to tell him that I felt the same way. That I was terrified of losing him because of a misplaced word or a misunderstood tone. That I'd spent the past day imagining a future where I never learned to joke in English, never learned to be myself in this language. And I couldn't bear the thought of that future. But instead, I started crying. Not pretty crying. The kind where your face crumples and you can't breathe and you're pretty sure everyone in the diner is staring at you. Tom didn't say anything. He just reached across the table and took my hand. You know what I miss? I finally managed to say, my voice thick and broken. I miss being funny. I was funny. I could make people laugh. And now I can't even make a joke about vegetables without sounding like I'm giving a lecture. Tom's face did something complicated. He looked like he was trying not to laugh and trying not to cry at the same time. The vegetable joke, he said slowly. I think I get it now. It was about the zucchini being too big, right? I nodded, wiping my face with my sleeve.
It was funny, he said.
I just didn't catch it the first time. I'm slow.
You're not slow, I said.
My English is slow. Then we're both slow. That's what I'm trying to tell you. There's a concept in psychology called the second language self. It's the idea that when you learn a new language, you don't just learn new words, you construct a new version of yourself. That version isn't the same as your first language self. It's shyer, maybe, or more direct. It laughs at different things. It gets hurt by different things. And the people who love you have to learn to love that version too, even while you're still figuring out who it is. Tom was trying to learn my second language self. And I was trying to learn the version of him that emerged when he was with someone who didn't expect him to be the person he'd been before the
va.
We were both building ourselves in a language neither of us fully owned, and that made us clumsy. It made us hurt each other without meaning to, but it also made us careful. It made us slow. It made us listen. We finished our coffee that day and walked back to his place. We didn't talk much. But when we got to his door, he stopped and turned to me. I don't care if you're funny in English, he said. I care that you're here. I care that you're trying. That's enough. You're enough. I kissed him then. It was the first time. His lips tasted like coffee, and his hand was warm on the back of my neck, and when we pulled apart, he was smiling. Not his small, careful smile. A real one. The kind that changed his whole face. I've been wanting to do that for a while, he said. Why didn't you? I asked. He shrugged. I didn't have the words. We stood there for a moment, both of us understanding that sometimes the words come after the thing they're meant to describe. Sometimes you have to kiss someone before you know what to call it. Sometimes you have to be lost together before you can find the way home. Learning to speak with the heart. After that first kiss, everything changed and nothing changed. We still met on Saturdays. We still walked through his neighborhood and sat in the diner and drank coffee that was too hot and talked about things that felt too big for the small space between us. But something had shifted beneath the surface, like the current of a river that looks calm from the bank but moves differently once you're in it. The thing I noticed most was that my English started to change. Not in the way I'd expected. I didn't suddenly become fluent or stop making mistakes. Instead, I stopped caring about the mistakes. Or rather, I stopped letting them silence me. When I was with Tom, I found myself reaching for words I'd never used before, words I didn't know I had. They came out wrong sometimes, in the wrong order or with the wrong ending, but they came out. And he listened. There's a concept in linguistics called affective primacy. It's the idea that emotion comes before cognition, that we feel before we think, and that our feelings shape the way we process language. When you're anxious, your brain filters language through a net of fear. When you're safe, the net opens. What Tom had given me, without either of us naming it, was safety. And safety was teaching me English faster than any textbook ever could. One evening, we were sitting on his porch after a walk. The sky was doing that thing it does in Southern California, where the sunset looks like someone spilled paint across the horizon. I was telling him about my father, who had passed away a few years before I left my country. I'd never talked about this in English before. I'd never wanted to. The words felt too heavy, too private, too likely to get lost in translation. But that evening, something came out. I don't remember exactly what I said. I remember stumbling over the past tense, mixing up he was and he is, because in my mind my father was both gone and still present. I remember Tom's hand on my knee, steady and warm. I remember the sentence that finally emerged, clear as water. I think he would have liked you. Tom didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, what would he have liked about me? This was the kind of question that would have terrified me a few months earlier. A question about hypotheticals, about the subjunctive mood, about expressing something I couldn't even fully articulate in my native language. But I tried anyway. I said, he liked people who were quiet. He said loud people are trying to prove something. Quiet people already know what they have. Tom smiled. That sounds like a good man. He was, I said. And then, because the words were there and I was tired of waiting for the perfect moment, I said, I love you. I think I've loved you for a while. I just didn't know how to say it in English. He turned to look at me. The sunset was behind him, painting his hair gold at the edges. His face was doing something I'd never seen before, open, unguarded, like he'd forgotten to hide. I love you too, he said. I didn't know how to say it in any language. We sat there until the light faded and the streetlights came on. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. The words had done their work. Here's what I learned in that moment. Language is not a wall between people. It's a door. And you don't need to be fluent to walk through it. You just need to be brave enough to knock. The weeks that followed were the happiest of my time in America. Not because they were easy. They weren't. I was still struggling with job applications, still running out of money, still waking up at 3 a.m., wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake by leaving everything I knew. But now I had Tom. And having Tom meant having someone to say the hard things to, even when I couldn't say them well. I started to notice something interesting about the way I was learning English. When I was with him, my vocabulary expanded naturally. Words I'd studied and forgotten would suddenly appear in my mouth at the right moment. Sentences that would have tangled in my brain came out clean. But when I was alone, or when I was in a situation that made me anxious, a job interview, a phone call with a landlord, the words would disappear again. This is not a coincidence. There's a reason why language immersion works best in environments where you feel safe. Your brain's language centers are intimately connected to your emotional centers. When you're stressed, your brain prioritizes survival over communication. It literally redirects resources away from the parts that process syntax and vocabulary. But when you're calm and connected, those pathways open up. Tom was my pathway. Not because he was a teacher, but because he was a witness. He saw me struggling and didn't look away. He saw me making mistakes and didn't use them to measure my worth. He created a space where I could be wrong without being diminished, and in that space, I finally started to grow. One afternoon, we were walking through his neighborhood, and we passed the house with the crooked porch swing. Tom stopped and looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, I want to fix that someday. The swing. It was my grandmother's. My uncle has it now. He doesn't use it. I want to ask him if I can have it. Fix it up. Put it on my porch. This was the longest sentence he'd said in weeks. I looked at him and saw something I hadn't seen before. Hope. Not the abstract hope of someone who's been trained to say, it gets better. The concrete hope of a man imagining a future where he sits on a porch swing with someone he loves. I took his hand. I'll help you fix it, I said. I'm good with my hands. He laughed. I know. We stood there for a moment, two people who had both lost so much, imagining a future built from reclaimed wood and borrowed tools. It wasn't the American dream I'd come here looking for. There was no corner office, no six-figure salary, no house with a white picket fence. But there was a porch swing. There was a man who waited for me to find my words. There was a language we were building together, word by word, mistake by mistake. I started to understand that fluency is not about never making mistakes. Fluency is about staying in the conversation long enough for the mistakes to become part of the story. It's about being willing to sound foolish in order to sound like yourself. It's about trusting that the person on the other side of the table will wait for you to find the word you're reaching for. Tom was teaching me this without ever saying it. He was teaching me that the goal of language is not perfection. The goal is connection. And connection doesn't require perfect grammar. It requires presence. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to say, I don't have the words for this yet, and trust that the other person will stay anyway. I was falling in love with him, yes. But I was also falling in love with English, the English that existed between us. The English that was messy and incomplete and more honest than any perfectly constructed sentence could ever be. This was the language I'd been searching for. Not the language of textbooks and job interviews. The language of porch swings and sunsets and hands held in the dark. And somewhere in that mess of imperfect sentences, I found myself. The proposal in simple words. 6 months after that first kiss, I found myself standing in Tom's kitchen on a Sunday morning, watching him make pancakes. This had become our ritual. Saturdays were for long walks and diner coffee. Sundays were for pancakes and the kind of slow, unstructured time that felt like the opposite of everything I'd been chasing when I first arrived in this country. He was wearing a faded t-shirt with a hole in the collar and his army boots, which he wore with everything, even shorts. He was humming something under his breath, an old song his grandmother used to sing, he told me once. The kitchen smelled like butter and syrup and the particular warmth of a space that has been lived in by someone who knows how to be still. I was watching him the way I'd been watching him for months now, noticing things I'd somehow missed before. The way his shoulders relaxed when he was cooking, like this was the only time his body forgot to be alert. The way he'd flip a pancake and wait exactly 3 seconds before checking the underside, like he timed it perfectly. The way he'd glance at me every so often, not saying anything, just checking that I was still there. I was still there. I'd been there more and more, my studio apartment becoming a place I visited rather than a place I lived. My toothbrush was in his bathroom. My favorite mug was in his cupboard. My books had migrated from my shelf to his, lining the small bookcase next to his collection of military history paperbacks. We hadn't talked about it. We hadn't talked about a lot of things. We'd learned to let things unfold in their own time, trusting that the words would come when they were ready. But that Sunday morning, something was different. He was quieter than usual. Not the comfortable quiet of someone who doesn't need to fill the silence. The tense quiet of someone carrying something heavy. I sat down at a small kitchen table and waited. He brought over a plate of pancakes and sat across from me. He didn't eat. He just looked at his hands, then at me, then back at his hands. I've been trying to figure out how to say this for a while, he said. I wrote it down. A bunch of times. But every time I wrote it, it sounded like someone else. Like a greeting card.
Not me.
I felt my heart start to beat faster. I knew what was coming. Not because he'd given any obvious sign, but because I knew him. I knew the way he circled a thing before he said it, like a dog finding the right spot to lie down. I knew that his silence was not emptiness but fullness, words gathering themselves into the shape he needed them to be. You don't have to write it down, I said. Just say it, however it comes out. He nodded. He took a breath. And then he said the simplest, most perfect thing I've ever heard. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I don't have a ring. I don't have a speech. I don't have any of the things you're supposed to have for this. But I have a porch that needs a swing. I have a grandmother who would have loved you. I have mornings like this one, and I want to keep having them. With you.
He stopped.
His hands were flat on the table, palms down, like he was steadying himself against something. I know I don't talk much, he continued. I know I'm not easy. I know there are things about me that don't make sense. But when I'm with you, I don't need them to make sense. I just need you to stay. Will you stay? I was crying. Of course I was crying. Because in all the months I'd spent trying to learn English, trying to make my sentences perfect, trying to sound like someone who belonged, I'd forgotten something essential. The most important words in any language are the simplest ones.
Stay.
With you. Home. Yes, I said. Yes, yes, yes. He reached across the table and took my hands. His were shaking, which surprised me. I'd never seen Tom shake. I don't have a ring, he said again, apologetically. I don't need a ring, I said. I need you. That's all. Later, after we'd eaten the pancakes and washed the dishes and sat on the porch for an hour not talking because we didn't need to, I thought about what had just happened. I thought about all the elaborate marriage proposals I'd seen in movies, the flash mobs, the skywriting, the speeches that went on for minutes. Tom's proposal had lasted maybe 30 seconds. It had used words a child could understand.
Stay.
With you.
Will you stay?
And it had been the most fluent thing I'd ever heard. There's a lesson here that I want you to hold on to, especially if you're struggling with English right now. Language is not a test you pass by using big words. Language is a tool you use to reach another person. And the most powerful tools are often the simplest. A hand held, a question asked, a name said out loud. Tom didn't need a thesaurus to tell me he loved me. He didn't need perfect grammar or poetic metaphors. He needed the words he had, the words that were his, and the courage to say them. That's what fluency is. Not vocabulary. Courage. We got married 6 months later, on a Saturday morning at the courthouse. I wore a white dress I'd found at a thrift store. Tom wore his army dress uniform, which he'd had to dig out of a box in the closet. We invited no one. It wasn't that we didn't have people we could have invited. Tom's mother would have come, a few of his old army buddies. But we both wanted it to be just us. 2 people who had learned to speak a language together, standing in front of a judge. Saying words that had been said 1,000,000 times before, but had never belonged to us until that moment. Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?
Ido.
Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?
Ido.
2 words. 2 syllables. The shortest sentence in the English language. And somehow, they contained everything. Afterward, we walked to the diner where we'd had our first real conversation. The same booth, the same cracked vinyl, the same coffee that was too hot. The waitress, who had watched us come in together for over a year now, brought us a slice of pie with 2 candles stuck in it. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Tom looked at me across the table. You know what I was thinking about this morning, he said. When we were standing there, in front of the judge? What? I was thinking about the first time you said coffee, please, with a white. I was thinking about how you looked when you said it. Like you were asking for something you weren't sure you deserved. He took my hand. You deserve it. You deserve everything. I laughed, because crying in a diner seemed like something I'd done too many times already. My English has gotten better since then, I said. I know the word for cream now. I know, he said, but I liked the way you said it then. The way you said everything then. Like each word cost you something. Like you meant every one of them. This is what I want you to understand. The person who is struggling with English right now, who pauses in the middle of sentences, who reaches for words that aren't there, that person is not failing. That person is doing something brave. That person is showing up, word by imperfect word, and offering themselves to another human being. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's more than enough. Sometimes it's everything. A new kind of family. Marriage, as it turns out, is not a destination. It's a language. And like any language, you learn it by speaking it badly until one day you realize you've been speaking it well for a while without noticing. The first year after we married was a year of small collisions. Not the dramatic kind. No slammed doors, no raised voices. The quiet kind. The kind that happens when two people who grew up on opposite sides of the world try to share a bathroom. Tom folded his towels in a specific way, corners tucked in, edges aligned. I threw mine over the rack like a flag of surrender. He ate dinner at exactly 6 p.m., a habit from the army that had calcified into something close to religion. I ate when I was hungry, which was sometimes 5 p.m., and sometimes 9 p.m., and sometimes not at all. He kept the house quiet, the way he'd learned to keep himself quiet. I filled the silence with music, with the sounds of cooking, with the noise of a person who grew up in a house where everyone talked over everyone else. These differences were not about language. Or maybe they were. Maybe every difference between two people is a translation problem. A matter of finding the right word for what you mean when the other person's dictionary is arranged differently than yours. One night, about 3 months into our marriage, Tom came home from a job interview that hadn't gone well. He didn't say it hadn't gone well, he didn't have to. I could see it in the way he walked through the door, his shoulders set at an angle that meant he was holding something in. I'd learned to read him by then. The silence that meant he was fine. The silence that meant he wasn't fine. This was the second kind. I made him tea. I sat down across from him at the kitchen table. I waited. This was our rhythm now. He would take as long as he needed, and I would be there when he was ready. They said I was overqualified, he finally said. Which is a nice way of saying they don't want someone who's been to war. Too much baggage. He said it flatly like a fact. But I heard the hurt underneath. I heard the weight of months of job applications, of interviews that went nowhere, of a country that thanked him for his service and then didn't know what to do with him. I wanted to say something. I wanted to have the right words. But in that moment, my English felt thin again, like it did in the early days. How do you comfort someone in a language that isn't yours? How do you say, I see you, I hear you, your pain is my pain when you're still not sure about the past tense of certain verbs? I reached across the table and took his hand. I didn't speak. I just held his hand, the way he'd held mine 1,000 times when I couldn't find the words. After a long moment, he squeezed my fingers. You know what I realized today? He said. I used to think the army was the hardest thing I'd ever do, but it wasn't. The hardest thing is coming home and figuring out who you are when no one's telling you what to do. He looked at me. You help with that. You don't tell me who to be. You just let me figure it out. This was the gift Tom had given me from the beginning, the gift I'd been trying to give back without knowing it. The gift of not fixing. Of sitting with someone in their struggle instead of trying to talk them out of it. Of trusting that the person you love is capable of finding their own way and that your job is simply to be there when they do. We learned each other's languages in those first years. Not just English and my native tongue. The language of silence. The language of touch. The language of tea made without being asked and towels folded or not folded and dinners eaten at 6 p.m. or 9 p.m. or not at all. And then, 2 years into our marriage, we learned a new language together. The language of parenthood. Our daughter was born on a Tuesday in April. The hospital room was bright and too warm, and Tom held her first because my arms were shaking too much. He looked down at this small, furious creature with her scrunched face and her fists balled like she was ready to fight the world. And he said something I'll never forget. He said, "She looks like you. She came out ready to fight for what she wants." I laughed. "She looks like a potato." "She's a beautiful potato," he said. "She's our potato." We named her Lily. It was the first word we agreed on without discussion. There was a patch of lilies in Tom's neighborhood, the ones that came up every spring whether anyone tended them or not. They were hardy. They survived. We wanted our daughter to be hardy. We wanted her to survive. The first months of parenthood were a blur of sleeplessness and wonder. Lily did not care about our schedules, our habits, our carefully constructed rhythms. She demanded to be fed at 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. She cried when we put her down and cried when we picked her up and cried for reasons we never quite deciphered. We took shifts. Tom would take the early morning, I would take the late night, and we would meet in the middle, exhausted and amazed that something this small could rearrange an entire life.
Here's what I noticed, though.
My English got better during those months. Not from studying, from talking to Lily. I would sit with her in the rocking chair Tom had fixed up, the one from his grandmother's porch, newly sanded and painted, and I would talk to her in a mix of English and my native language. I'd tell her stories from my childhood. I'd sing songs my mother sang to me. I'd describe the world in simple sentences, the kind a baby couldn't understand but somehow seemed to need anyway. "Look, Lily. The sun. The sun is yellow. The sun is warm. The sun is like a big light in the sky." Tom would sometimes stand in the doorway and listen. He never interrupted. Later, he told me he loved the sound of my voice when I talked to her. "You don't hesitate," he said. "You just talk." He was right. When I talked to Lily, I didn't worry about grammar or vocabulary or whether I was saying things correctly.
I just wanted her to hear my voice.
I wanted her to know that language was a gift, not a test. I wanted her to grow up unafraid of words. And in giving her that gift, I gave it to myself. When Lily was 6 months old, we took her to meet Tom's mother for the first time. She lived in a small town in Oregon, in a house with a garden that ran wild at the edges. She was a quiet woman, like her son, with the same gray eyes and the same way of watching before she spoke. She held Lily for a long time, not saying anything, just looking at her. Then she looked at me. "He's different with you," she said, lighter. I haven't seen him this light since before he left.
I didn't know what to say.
I still wasn't good at receiving compliments in English. I wasn't sure I deserved them. She seemed to understand. She smiled, a small smile that made her look exactly like Tom. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know. You gave my son his life back." That night, Tom and I sat on his mother's porch, Lily asleep in a portable crib beside us. The stars were out in a way they never were in the city. Tom pointed to a cluster of them and said, "My grandmother used to tell me those were the lights of all the people who'd gone ahead. She said they were watching, making sure we were okay." "Do you believe that?" I asked. He thought about it. "I want to," he said. "I want to believe she's watching. I want to believe she sees this." He gestured at the porch, at the crib, at me. "I want her to know I'm okay." I leaned my head on his shoulder. "She knows," I said. "I think she always knew." We sat there in the dark, two people who had found each other across oceans and languages and the wreckage of our separate pasts. We had a daughter now. We had a porch that needed a swing. We had a life that we were building together, word by word, day by day. And somewhere in the middle of all that building, I realized that I was no longer learning English. I was living it. I was dreaming in it. I was arguing in it and laughing in it and whispering lullabies in it to a child who would grow up speaking it as her first language. This was not the American dream I had come here looking for. I had imagined something grander, something more visible. A career, a title, a bank account that didn't make me wince when I checked it. But the dream I found was smaller and larger at the same time. It was a hand holding mine in the dark. It was a porch swing waiting to be fixed. It was a daughter who would never know the loneliness of being a stranger in her own life. This was the dream, and it was enough. The little teachers. The first time Lily corrected my English, she was 3 years old. We were sitting on the porch swing, the one Tom had finally fixed, sanded smooth and painted a pale blue, and I was telling her about a bird I'd seen in the yard. I said, "Look, Lily, the bird is more bigger than the one yesterday." She looked at me with a serious expression of a toddler who has just discovered a flaw in the universe.
"Mama," she said.
"It's not more bigger. It's bigger. You don't say more bigger." Tom, who was sitting on the steps below us, pretended to be very interested in his coffee cup. I could see his shoulders shaking. "You are correcting your mother?" I said, trying to sound stern but failing. "I'm helping," she said. "Daddy says we help each other." I looked at Tom. He had given up pretending and was openly laughing now, that rusty laugh that had become less rusty over the years. "She's not wrong," he said. I threw a pillow at him. He caught it. This was how it began. Lily, who had learned English from Tom and from the neighbors and from the endless stream of children's shows she watched with the intensity of a scholar, had become the household expert on the language I was still, after all these years, trying to master. She corrected my prepositions, my tenses, my stubborn habit of dropping articles. She did it with the casual cruelty of a child who has no idea that her mother spent years crying over verb conjugations. "Mama, it's on the table, not in the table. Mama, you say I went, not I goed. Mama, it's she and I, not me and her." Each correction was a small death and a small rebirth, a reminder that I was still not fluent, a reminder that I was still learning, still trying, still showing up. But here's what I noticed. Lily didn't correct me because she thought I was stupid. She corrected me because she thought I was worth correcting. Because she assumed, with the unshakable confidence of a child, that I wanted to get better. That we were all on the same team, trying to say things clearly so we could understand each other. Tom, who had spent years teaching me with patience and silence, now had a partner in his work. Lily was not patient. She was not silent. She was a small, fierce teacher who accepted no excuses and offered no shortcuts. She was exactly what I needed. When our second daughter, Maya, was born 2 years later, Lily took on a new role. She became Maya's English teacher too, narrating the world to her in a running commentary that never seemed to stop. "That's a dog. Can you say dog?"
"Dog. Good job."
"That's a tree."
"Tree."
"It's tall. Tall like Daddy." I watched this small person who had come from my body and learned my native language alongside English, become the bridge between the two worlds I inhabited. She spoke to me in my language when she wanted comfort, in English when she wanted to show off. She translated for Maya when I used the wrong word, and she translated for me when Maya's baby babble needed interpretation. One afternoon, I was helping Lily with her kindergarten homework. The assignment was to write a sentence about something she loved. She wrote, in wobbly letters, "I love my mom. She speaks 2 languages. She is brave." I stared at that sentence for a long time.
Brave.
She thought I was brave. Not struggling, not failing, not always getting the prepositions wrong.
Brave.
I kept that piece of paper in my wallet for months. I still have it somewhere, folded and creased, the pencil fading. It is one of the few things I own that I would run back into a burning house for. The girls grew, and the house grew with them. We added a garden to the backyard, Tom's project, though the girls and I helped, mostly by getting in the way. We planted tomatoes and peppers and a patch of mint that took over everything. Tom built a small fence to keep the mint contained. The mint ignored the fence. Our Saturdays changed. Instead of long walks through the neighborhood, we spent mornings at the park, pushing swings and catching children at the bottom of slides. Instead of diner coffee, we had picnics on blankets, sandwiches cut into triangles, juice boxes leaking onto everything. But the rhythm remained. The rhythm of being together, of being a family, of speaking in the hybrid language we had created for ourselves. A language that was part English, part my native tongue, part inside jokes and shorthand, and words that only made sense to the four of us. Tom, who had once struggled to say anything at all, now told the girls elaborate bedtime stories about a dog named Sergeant who went on adventures. The stories were not complicated. Sergeant found lost balls. Sergeant helped cats who were stuck in trees. Sergeant always came home at the end. But the girls listened with the same intensity Tom had once brought to listening to me, and I listened too, marveling at the man who had learned to speak again. One night, after the girls were asleep, Tom and I sat on the porch swing. The same swing that had once hung crooked on his grandmother's porch, now solid and straight, painted blue, creaking softly as we moved. "Do you remember," he said, "that first walk we took? When I showed you the house with the crooked swing?" I remember. I didn't think I'd ever fix it. I didn't think I'd ever have a reason to. He looked at the house behind us, the lights off in the girls' room, the soft glow from the kitchen where a dish was still drying on the counter. "I didn't think I'd have any of this," he said. "I came back from the war, and I thought my life was over. Not in a dramatic way. Just over. Like the story had ended, and I was supposed to close the book." He took my hand. "And then you showed up at the laundromat. You opened the wrong dryer, and my underwear fell on the floor. And you looked so embarrassed. I had to laugh. I hadn't laughed in so long. I'd forgotten I could." "We've come a long way from laundromats," I said. "We've come a long way from everything." We sat in silence for a while, the way we always had, comfortable with the quiet. Then I said something I'd been thinking about for weeks. "I think I'm finally fluent," I said. "Not perfect, but fluent. I don't think about the words anymore. They're just there." Tom looked at me. "You've been fluent for years," he said.
No.
"I've been trying for years. There's a difference."
He considered this.
"Maybe. But you know what I think? I think you were fluent the first time you said coffee, please, with the white, because you said what you needed. You made yourself understood. That's fluency. Everything after that is just practice." I leaned my head on his shoulder. The porch swing creaked. Somewhere in the house, a child murmured in her sleep, words I couldn't quite make out, but words that were hers. Words that belonged to a life we had built together. This was the language I had come to America to learn. Not English.
This.
The language of home. Redefining the dream. The morning it happened, I was standing in the kitchen making coffee. Not the diner coffee, not the instant I'd survived on in my first months here. Real coffee, ground fresh, brewed slowly in the French press Tom had bought me for my birthday 3 years ago. The kitchen was quiet. The girls were still asleep. Tom was outside, checking the garden, a morning ritual he'd adopted after retiring from a job he'd finally found. Not the job he'd wanted. Not the job he'd trained for, but a job at a hardware store that had turned into something like a second home. I poured the coffee into 2 mugs. One for me, one for him. I added cream to mine. I'd long since stopped thinking about the word for it. I walked to the back door and stepped onto the porch. The sun was just coming up, painting the garden in shades of gold and green. Tom was kneeling by the tomato plants, checking for bugs, his hands in the dirt. He looked up when I came out and he smiled. That smile. The one that had been rare when we met and was now something I saw every day. I handed him his coffee. He took it, his fingers brushing mine. And in that moment, something shifted in my chest. Not a dramatic shift. Not a lightning bolt or a revelation. Just a small, quiet settling. Like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known was there. I sat down on the porch swing, our porch swing, the one that had belonged to his grandmother, the one we'd fixed together, the one where we'd held our daughters and watched the seasons change, and I looked at this life we had built. The garden with its runaway mint, the house with its peeling paint that we kept meaning to repaint, the bicycles leaning against the fence, one too small for either girl now. The sound of a bird I couldn't name singing from a tree I'd learned to recognize. The smell of coffee and soil and the particular scent of morning that exists nowhere else but here. And I thought about the dream I had carried with me on that plane all those years ago. The dream of a job with a title, of a salary that would impress my family back home, of an apartment with furniture from a catalog and a view of something that looked like the movies, of an English so perfect that no one would ever know I hadn't grown up speaking it. None of that had happened. The job I'd finally found was part-time at a community center, helping other immigrants navigate the systems I'd once been lost in. The salary was modest. The furniture in our house was a mix of Tom's old things and secondhand finds, and the occasional piece we'd built ourselves. The view from our porch was of a garden that needed weeding and a street where neighbors waved but didn't know each other's names. And my English was still not perfect. I still mixed up prepositions. I still sometimes said more bigger when I was tired or distracted. Lily still corrected me, though now she did it with a teenager's exasperated affection instead of a toddler's earnestness. But sitting on that porch swing, watching Tom water the tomatoes, I realized something that had been true for years without me knowing it. The dream I'd been chasing was never the real dream. The real dream was this. This quiet morning. This man. These children sleeping inside. This language I had learned not in classrooms, but in conversations, in arguments, in lullabies, in the long silences between words. The American dream, as they call it, is supposed to be about success, about rising, about becoming more than you were. But I had come to believe something different. The American dream, for me, had become about something much simpler. It was about becoming enough. Enough for myself. Enough for the people I loved. Enough to look at a garden and a porch swing and a coffee mug with cream in it and feel that there was nothing missing. Tom came up the steps and sat beside me on the swing. His hands were dirty, his shirt smeared with soil, his hair sticking up in the back. He looked nothing like the men I had once imagined myself ending up with. He was everything I hadn't known I needed. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. I could have told him the truth. I could have said, "I'm thinking about how I spent years chasing a dream that wasn't mine and how I almost missed the one that was." I could have said, "I'm thinking about the night you showed up at my apartment in the rain, and how I fell in love with you before I had the words to say it." I could have said, "I'm thinking about how lucky I am to have this porch swing and this garden and this life that looks nothing like the pictures I carried in my head." But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I said something simpler, something truer. "I'm thinking that I'm home." Tom looked at me for a long moment. Then he set down his coffee, took my hand, and said, "You always were. You just didn't know it yet." The girls woke up not long after. Maya came running out in her pajamas, her hair a tangle, demanding pancakes. Lily followed more slowly, a book in her hand, already lost in whatever world she'd found. They were so different, these two. Maya, who had inherited my energy and Tom's stubbornness. Lily, who had inherited Tom's stillness and my habit of watching before speaking. They sat on the porch with us, Maya chattering about a dream she'd had, Lily reading in the corner, and I watched them the way I'd watched Tom. The way I'd watched this life I hadn't planned for. I thought about the word home. In English, it's a small word. For letters. Easy to say. But I had learned that it's one of the hardest words in any language because it doesn't mean a place. It means a feeling. And feelings take time to name. I had spent my first years in America searching for home in the wrong places. In job titles, in perfect grammar, in the approval of people who didn't know me. But home had been here all along, waiting for me to stop running long enough to see it. It was in a man who had learned to speak again, because I let him take his time. It was in children who corrected my English and loved me anyway. It was in a porch swing that had once belonged to someone who knew that the best things in life are the ones you fix with your own hands. That afternoon, Tom and I took the girls to the diner. The same diner. The one with the cracked vinyl and the coffee that was still too hot, and the waitress who had watched us grow from strangers to lovers to parents. We sat in the same booth, the four of us squeezed in together, and ordered pancakes and eggs and coffee for the grown-ups and chocolate milk for the girls. The waitress came by to say hello. She was older now, her hair grayer, her smile the same. She looked at us, all four of us, and said, "You know, I remember when it was just the two of you. You used to sit here for hours, barely talking. I thought you were fighting." "We were learning," Tom said. "Learning what?" He looked at me. "How to talk to each other." The waitress laughed and walked away, and Maya asked what he meant, and Lily, without looking up from her book, said, "They were learning English." "Maya, it's a long story." "It's not that long," I said. "It's just a story about a woman who came to this country with a suitcase and a dream, and a man who had forgotten how to dream at all. They found each other in a laundromat. They learned to speak the same language. And they lived, as they say, happily ever after." Maya frowned. "That's not a real story. That's a fairy tale." I looked at Tom. He was smiling, that rusty smile that had become the most familiar thing in my life. "It's a real story," I said. "It's ours." A hand to hold is enough. The years have a way of folding into each other when you're not looking. One morning you're standing in a laundromat, unable to say the word for cream. And the next morning you're sitting at a kitchen table with a teenager who rolls her eyes when you mix up your prepositions, and a 7-year-old who still believes you know everything. The porch swing creaks in the same places it always has. The mint still ignores the fence. The coffee still tastes better when someone else makes it. I've been in America for over a decade now. 10 years of learning, of failing, of getting back up. 10 years of a language that once felt like a wall and now feels like the air I breathe. I still make mistakes. I still pause sometimes, reaching for a word that sits just out of reach. But I no longer apologize for the pause. I no longer feel the need to explain that I'm still learning, because I am always learning. We all are. Even Tom, who was born here, who speaks English the way he breathes, still reaches for words sometimes. Still sits in silence when the words won't come. The other night, Lily came to me with a problem. She is 15 now, which means her problems are the kind that don't have easy solutions. She sat on the edge of my bed, her face a storm of frustration, and she said, "Mama, how do you say something when you don't have the words for it?" I looked at her, this child who had corrected my English before she could tie her shoes, who had always been so confident in her language. And I saw myself, not the version of me that stood in the immigration line with a blank mind. The version of me that sat across from Tom in a diner, trying to say something true with a vocabulary that felt too small for the task. "You say it anyway," I told her. You say it badly if you have to. You use the wrong words. You pause. You start over. And if the person listening cares about you, they will wait. They will help you find the words. They will understand that the thing you're trying to say is bigger than the words you have for it. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she hugged me, quick and fierce, and left. I heard her talking to Tom in the kitchen later, her voice low and urgent, his voice steady and calm. I didn't listen to the words. I didn't need to. I knew the shape of the conversation. It was the same conversation we'd been having for years in different forms, with different people. The conversation about how to be human, how to be seen, how to reach across the space between you and another person and say, "Here I am. This is what I feel.
Do you see me?"
This is what I have learned in the 10 years since I stepped off that plane. Language is not about being right. It's about being seen. It's not about perfect grammar. It's about imperfect connection. It's not about the words you know. It's about the words you are brave enough to use, even when you're not sure they're the right ones. There is a moment in every language learner's life when you stop translating and start thinking. When the words come without the intermediary of your native tongue. When you dream in the new language. That moment happened for me somewhere in the middle of a sleepless night with a newborn, or maybe on a Saturday walk through Tom's neighborhood, or maybe at the diner, drinking coffee that was too hot and laughing at a joke I'd finally told correctly. I can't pinpoint it. It was less a moment and more slow migration, like the seasons changing. But there is another moment that matters more. The moment when you stop asking whether you're speaking correctly and start asking whether you're speaking truly. The moment when you realize that the goal is not fluency. The goal is connection. And connection does not require perfection. It requires presence. It requires vulnerability. It requires the willingness to be misunderstood and to try again. Tom and I are sitting on the porch swing now. It's late. The girls are asleep. The garden is dark. The only light comes from the kitchen window, a small square of yellow that spills onto the steps. He has his hand in mine, the same hand that held mine in a laundromat, in a diner, in a hospital room, on 1,000 walks through 1,000 streets. "You know what I was thinking about today?" he says. His voice is quiet, the way it gets when he's saying something he's been holding for a while. "What?" "I was thinking about that first time I saw you. At the laundromat. You were so frustrated. You couldn't figure out which dryer was yours. You looked like you wanted to cry." I did want to cry. I know. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. I didn't know if I had the words. I didn't know if I had anything to offer anyone anymore. He squeezes my hand. "And then your laundry fell on the floor. And you looked so embarrassed. And I thought, here's someone who's having a worse day than I am. Here's someone who needs someone to say it's okay. You said it was okay." I did. That was enough. He is quiet for a moment. The porch swing creaks. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, then stops. The world is settling into the particular stillness of late night. The kind of stillness that makes everything feel possible and fragile at the same time. "Do you think we found it?" he asks. "The American dream. Do you think this is it?" I look at our hands, intertwined on his knee. I look at the house behind us, the one with the peeling paint we still haven't repainted, the one where our daughters are sleeping, the one we have filled with years of imperfect sentences and perfect silences. I think the American dream is a story people tell themselves, I say. A story about what they're supposed to want. A big house. A lot of money. A life that looks like something you can put on a postcard. I turn to look at him. His face is half in shadow, half in the light from the kitchen window. He is older now, his hair grayer, the lines around his eyes deeper. He is still the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. But the real dream, I say, the one they don't put on postcards, is smaller. It's a porch swing that belonged to someone's grandmother. It's a garden that needs weeding. It's a man who waited for me to find my words and a daughter who corrects my English because she knows I want to get better. It's this hand holding mine. Tom lifts our joined hands and looks at them. I spent a lot of years thinking I'd lost everything, he says. I didn't know I was just waiting for you. We sit in the silence that follows. It is not an empty silence. It is full. Full of years. Full of words we've said and words we haven't needed to say. Full of the lives we have built together, word by word, day by day. I think about the woman I was when I stepped off that plane. She was so afraid. She was so sure she had to be perfect to deserve anything. She was so certain that the American dream was something she had to earn, something she had to prove herself worthy of. But here is what she didn't know. The dream was never something to earn. It was something to build. And you don't build a life with perfect grammar. You build it with imperfect love, with patience, with the willingness to say the wrong thing and try again, with the courage to open the wrong dryer and let someone's laundry fall on the floor. Because that's how you meet the person who will teach you what you've been looking for all along. The American dream, for me, was never about America.
It was about a hand holding mine.
It was about a language I learned not from textbooks but from living. It was about finding a place where I could be imperfect and still be loved. It was about coming home. Tom's hand is warm in mine. The porch swing creaks. The night is quiet. And I am exactly where I need to be. Let me tell you what the American dream actually looks like. It's not a house with a white picket fence. It's not a six-figure salary or a green card framed on the wall. It's not even the day you finally pronounce rural without sounding like you're choking on a cracker. The American dream, for me, showed up on an ordinary Tuesday. I was standing in the kitchen, making coffee, when Michael walked up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and rested his chin on my shoulder. We didn't say anything. We just stood there. His hand found mine. And in that silence, I realized I'd stopped being afraid. For years, I thought success meant fluency. I measured my worth by how many words I could string together without a pause. I'd replay conversations in my head, counting mistakes like a scorecard. But somewhere along the way, somewhere between the rainy bench and the wedding, between learning to argue in English and learning to laugh in English, I stopped translating in my head. I stopped rehearsing. I just lived. And that, it turns out, is the secret no language school will ever charge you for. Here's what neuroscience whispers that most people miss. Your brain builds language pathways through emotional safety, not repetition drills. When you're relaxed, when you feel seen, when someone's hand is holding yours, your hippocampus, the memory center, finally opens up. Words stop being obstacles. They become what they were always meant to be, bridges. I didn't learn English faster because I studied harder. I learned it because I finally had a reason to speak that was bigger than my fear of messing up. I had someone who wanted to hear me, even my broken, awkward, half-formed sentences. Our kids were born into that safety. And let me tell you, having children when you're still not sure you speak the language is a humbling experience. My son's first word was more. My daughter's was why. And somewhere between toddler tantrums and bedtime stories, I realized I wasn't just teaching them English, they were teaching me a new way of being American. They'd correct my pronunciation with a brutal honesty only a 4-year-old possesses. Mom, it's squirrel, not squirrel. And I'd laugh because finally, it didn't sting. It felt like home. Michael still talks slowly sometimes. Not because he thinks I need it, but because he's the kind of man who believes words are worth waiting for. He'll pause mid-sentence, look me in the eye, and say exactly what he means.
No ruse.
No performance. He taught me that the American dream isn't about arriving. It's about being welcomed. And you can't be welcomed by a country. You can only be welcomed by people. I remember the night I finally asked him the question I'd been too scared to voice. We were lying in bed, the room dark, the kids asleep. I said, "Did you ever think I wasn't worth the wait?" He turned to me, his hand finding mine under the blanket. "Every day," he said. "But not because of you. Because I didn't think I deserved to be happy. You were the one who waited for me to figure that out." That's when I understood. This whole time, I thought I was the one who needed to learn English to belong. But Michael was learning too, learning to let someone in, learning to believe that love could be simple, learning that a woman with an accent and a messy past could be the best part of his quiet American life. We built a marriage out of small words.
Yes. Stay. I'm sorry.
I'm here. No fancy vocabulary required. If you're watching this and you're stuck in fear, stuck in silence, stuck in the belief that you'll never be good enough to speak, I want you to take a breath. Your language journey is not a race. It's not a test. It's a slow, weird, beautiful process of finding people who are willing to sit with you in the rain. And I promise you, they exist. They're not in the grammar books. They're in the diners, the parks, the quiet corners of your city. They're the ones who don't care if you say squirrel wrong. They just want to hear your voice. So, what if the American dream is a hand holding yours? What if everything you're chasing, the fluency, the confidence, the sense of belonging, isn't a destination but a person, or a moment, or a morning when you wake up and realize you're no longer afraid of your own words? That's the real story. Not a story about learning English. A story about learning to let yourself be loved while you're still a work in progress. And friend, if you're out there trying to build a life in a language that sometimes feels like it's fighting you, let me be the one to tell you. You're not behind. You're not failing. You're just in the middle of the best part, the part where everything is still being built, and every small word you manage to say is a victory. Michael and I still hold hands. Every day. In the car, on walks, in the kitchen while coffee brews. Sometimes I think about that first night on the bench, how lost I was, how silent he was, and I smile. Because that silence became a conversation that's still going. And it's the only fluency I ever really needed. If this story touched something in you, if you're still searching for your own version of that hand to hold, don't let the algorithm lose us. Hit that subscribe button. Tap the bell so you never miss a story. And if this video made you feel a little less alone, share it with someone who needs to hear that they're not drowning, they're just standing in the rain, waiting for someone to sit beside them. That's all for today. I'll be making more stories like this in the future. Real stories, slow English, the kind that reminds you why you started. Subscribe so we can keep walking this path together.